To the Red Army, it was salvation. To the Germans, it was a nightmare. Its distinctive chatter dominated close-quarter battles across the Eastern Front. In trenches, alleys, and factory floors, the PPSH turned brutal hand-to-hand struggles into something even deadlier. Soldiers said whoever had the burp gun had the advantage. But behind the fearsome reputation was another truth: the PPSH was never meant to be cherished. It was stamped from cheap metal, churned out in numbers so massive that the Soviets didn't worry if one broke, jammed, or was lost. They would simply hand the soldier another. It was deadly. It was everywhere. And it was built to be thrown away. To understand the PPSH, you have to go back to the late 1930s. The Soviet Union had experimented with submachine guns before. They had the PPD series, the PPD-34 and PPD-40, designed by Vasily Degtyaryov. These early weapons were effective but slow to manufacture. They required too much milling and machining, the kind of precise industrial work the USSR couldn't afford when facing the threat of full-scale war. By 1940, the Soviets needed something new, something simple, something they could mass-produce by the millions. That's when Georgy Shpagin, a Russian designer, stepped forward. His solution was elegant in its brutality: a submachine gun built mostly from stamped steel. Easy to press, easy to weld, requiring less skilled labor. He cut corners everywhere he could, not to reduce effectiveness, but to simplify. His design became the Pistolet Pulemyot Shpagina 1941, or PPSH-41. It was rushed into service at the worst possible time, just as Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Entire armies were encircled. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Weapons were desperately short. Shpagin's new design arrived just in time. Factories across the USSR began stamping out PPSHs in enormous quantities. By the end of 1942, over 1.5 million had been made. By the war's end, that number swelled to over 6 million. It became the Red Army's defining weapon. On paper, the PPSH was a monster. Caliber: 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev, a fast pistol round based on the Mauser cartridge. Rate of fire: 900 rounds per minute. That's 15 rounds every second. Effective range: around 150 to 200 meters, though in reality, it dominated at closer ranges. Magazines: most famously, the 71-round drum. Later, a 35-round curved box magazine. The drum magazine gave it an iconic look, and in theory, overwhelming firepower. In practice, it was heavy, rattled loudly, and often misfed. Still, the psychological impact of facing a soldier with 70 bullets ready to spray was undeniable. German soldiers with bolt-action rifles found themselves completely outclassed in close quarters. They needed precision and time to fire. The PPSH needed neither. A squeeze of the trigger, and a room could be cleared in seconds. For Soviet infantry, the PPSH was more than a weapon. It was a lifeline. Accounts from Stalingrad describe squads armed entirely with PPSHs storming German-held buildings in coordinated waves. The chatter of multiple burp guns echoing through concrete halls was said to be deafening and terrifying. One Soviet veteran recalled, "We had no fear with the PPSH. If the Germans were inside, we went in. The PPSH spoke louder than any orders." The gun's speed gave confidence. Even poorly trained recruits, handed a PPSH and told to advance, could unleash deadly firepower. Accuracy mattered less when you had 70 rounds to pour into a target zone. But the Germans quickly recognized the weapon's effectiveness. Many began using captured PPSHs themselves, sometimes rechambered to fire 9mm rounds, compatible with their own logistics. This alone speaks to the weapon's battlefield dominance. The enemy trusted it almost as much as the Soviets did. The PPSH was the product of necessity. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. Quality was secondary to numbers. One factory in Moscow, under bombardment, kept producing PPSHs even as bombs fell nearby. Workers would grab damaged weapons, toss them aside, and keep stamping out new ones. The design allowed for it. Unlike precision rifles, which required care, the PPSH was crude. Crude, but effective. In many ways, it symbolized the Soviet war effort itself: cheap, expendable, but overwhelming in sheer mass. By 1943, entire Soviet units were equipped almost entirely with PPSHs. This changed the nature of combat on the Eastern Front. Where German squads relied on rifles supported by a single machine gun, Soviet squads could bring overwhelming firepower from every direction. At the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, infantry fighting among wrecks and trenches often came down to who had more automatic weapons. The PPSH tilted that balance. But while it was feared and respected, cracks were beginning to show. Soldiers knew the weapon could be both a savior and a curse. The truth was more complicated than its reputation. And that's where the shocking reality begins. The PPSH-41 had earned a reputation as one of the deadliest weapons of World War II. But the soldiers who carried it knew another truth, one that doesn't fit the myth. The PPSH was fast, brutal, and overwhelming, but was also flawed. Cheaply made, temperamental, and sometimes as dangerous to the man firing it as to the enemy in his sights. The first problem was obvious, the rate of fire. At 900 rounds per minute, the PPSH could chew through a full drum in under 5 seconds. For the man holding it, that kind of speed was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it could drown an enemy in bullets. On the other, it left the shooter with an empty gun almost instantly. Soldiers often wasted ammunition, spraying wildly rather than aiming. One Soviet officer recalled bitterly, "The men fired as if the cartridges were free." In one street fight, a platoon exhausted its supply in minutes. Afterward, we had nothing but bayonets. The high rate of fire meant logistics officers hated the weapon. In a war where supply lines were fragile, a company of PPSH gunners could drain the ammo reserves of an entire battalion. The 71-round drum was iconic, but in practice, it was unreliable. Each drum was hand-fitted to a specific weapon. A drum that worked perfectly in one PPSH might jam constantly in another. Soldiers in the field didn't have time to test compatibility. When a drum jammed in the middle of a firefight, it was often fatal. Some veterans preferred the smaller 35-round box magazine simply because it was more dependable. One Soviet infantryman put it bluntly, "The drum gave us courage, but the box kept us alive." Despite being built from stamped steel, the PPSH was not light. Fully loaded with the drum, it weighed almost 5 kilograms. In the mud and snow of the Eastern Front, lugging that extra weight was exhausting. German MP-40 gunners could reload faster and carry more ammunition with less burden. A Soviet soldier with a PPSH was powerful up close, but clumsy on long marches and vulnerable in open terrain. The PPSH was designed for close combat. Beyond 100 meters, its effectiveness dropped sharply. The 7.62 by 25 millimeters round was fast, but lightweight. It struggled to penetrate cover or helmets at longer ranges. A German armed with a Kar 98K bolt-action rifle could still pick off PPSH gunners before they got close. Soviet doctrine often solved this problem by sheer numbers, overwhelmed the enemy with waves of burp guns until they couldn't shoot fast enough to stop them. The human cost of this strategy was staggering. Perhaps the most shocking truth about the PPSH was this: it wasn't built to last. Unlike the finely crafted rifles of Europe, the PPSH was stamped from cheap steel, with a wooden stock often made from whatever lumber was available. Many broke after heavy use. Others warped in the rain or cracked in the cold. Factories didn't care. They weren't designing a weapon for years of service. They were designing a weapon that could be produced quickly, used briefly, and replaced. Soviet command knew it. Soldiers knew it. The PPSH was deadly, but disposable. For the men who carried it, the PPSH was both protection and a curse. In close combat, it gave them an edge. But in open fields, facing German machine guns or tanks, it offered little. Soviet infantry assaults often relied on sheer numbers, with PPSH gunners charging across killing zones. Many didn't make it. A grim statistic: during the Battle of Stalingrad, average Soviet infantry survival was measured in days, not weeks. The PPSH gave them firepower, but it couldn't change the reality of the battlefield. One survivor wrote after the war, "We carried the burp gun with pride, but most of the men who held it never lived to grow old." When the war ended in 1945, the PPSH had become one of the most recognizable weapons in the world. Over 6 million had been produced. It armed not just the Red Army, but also Chinese communists, Korean fighters, and later, insurgents and militias across the globe. But the Soviets themselves moved on quickly. By the late 1940s, the PPSH was being phased out in favor of the PPS-43, a smaller, simpler, and more reliable submachine gun. And soon after, in 1947, the world saw the arrival of the AK-47. The Kalashnikov rifle made the PPSH obsolete almost overnight. The AK offered automatic fire, longer range, better reliability, and more stopping power. Where the PPSH had been crude and disposable, the AK was rugged and enduring. For the Soviet Union, it was a leap forward. For the PPSH, it was the end of an era. Still, the PPSH lived on in conflicts around the world. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean troops carried it against American forces. U.S. Marines described terrifying nighttime assaults where hundreds of burp guns chattered in unison. In Vietnam, Viet Cong fighters used it against U.S. troops. In Africa, in the Middle East, and even in South America, the PPSH appeared in the hands of guerrillas and revolutionaries. Its sheer numbers meant it would never truly disappear. But its reputation remained a paradox. To some, it was a symbol of Soviet resilience. To others, it was a crude tool, proof that the USSR valued quantity over quality, men over lives. The PPSH didn't shape future weapons the way the German Sturmgewehr 44 did, but it taught an important lesson. Mass production wins wars. The idea that a weapon doesn't have to be perfect, only good enough, would echo through Cold War armaments. It also proved the effectiveness of giving entire units automatic weapons. This lesson was carried forward directly into Soviet doctrine, and ultimately, into the design of the AK-47. In the end, the PPSH is remembered not just for its firepower, but for the human cost attached to it. Millions of Soviet soldiers carried it into battle. Millions never returned. The gun gave them a fighting chance, but it also embodied the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. Men were treated as expendable, just like the weapon in their hands. The PPSH-41 was deadly. It was feared. It was everywhere. But in the eyes of the Soviet war machine, it was never more than a tool, cheap, effective, and replaceable. Like the soldiers themselves, it was made for war, not for survival.